He found her in the moonlight, though the moon was hidden behind clouds. Dust motes drifted across the interior of Khal Drogo's great tent, glimmering in the half-light of the banked braziers. Jorah Mormont paused in the entrance and looked upon Daenerys Targaryen, the silver-haired Khaleesi whom he served. She was sitting on a spread of thick rugs, her eyes hollow, her trembling hands pressed tightly against her abdomen. Outside, the Dothraki made soft noises, restless in the darkness. They didn't sing or laugh tonight. The tension in the air was a living thing. Nothing Jorah thought would ever be the same again. Yet he hadn't stepped forward in cruelty or cunning. He had done it. He had ended Khal Drogo's life for her. He had asked himself 1,000 times whether it was the right thing, the honorable thing. Honor was a slippery word, one he had once cherished but had cast aside when he was exiled from Westeros. Still, he knew that if he had not intervened when he did, Daenerys might have faced unthinkable brutality from those who doubted her place in the Khalasar. Drogo's own blood riders had looked at her with black suspicion since the moment she had tried to save her Khal with the help of the Magi. They resented her meddling in the old ways, they called it dark magic, and Jorah could see the form of rebellion stirring in their eyes. Khal Drogo, now feverish, weakened, and no longer invincible, was no better than a wounded animal at the mercy of his pack. Yet the thought of driving a blade into Drogo's heart had nearly unmanned Jorah. Drogo had been her husband, the father of the child she carried, and had shown her respect in his rough Dothraki ways. She had blossomed into a Khaleesi beneath his protection. Had Jorah not known Drogo's vow to conquer the 7 kingdoms for her, perhaps he would have let events unfold naturally, letting the fever take the call. But Drogo was stubbornly strong, caught in that middle place between delirium and primal fury. The entire camp swirled with rumors. Some said he was too far gone to ride, others that he would rise again and punish those who questioned him. The tension was unbearable. Jorah had moved first in a moment that was half heroic and half desperate. He remembered kneeling beside the sleeping Khal in the hush of night. Drogo's skin was hot to the touch, the infection raging under his muscles, a blackened scab across his chest that oozed foul fluids. Jorah had pressed the dagger gently, so gently. If Drogo had awakened, he might have torn Jorah's head off with his bare hands. But Jorah was skilled enough to slip the blade in swiftly. And when Drogo's eyes fluttered open for one confused moment, he pressed his calloused palm over the Khal's mouth. A single, hot breath brushed Jorah's fingers. Then nothing. Drogo's eyes stared, glassy as dull stones. At once, Jorah felt a lead weight in his belly. He had done it. He, a knight disgraced, murderer of a Khal, had taken a step that would change not only Daenerys Targaryen's future, but the future of all the Dothraki who followed her. He knew there would be no going back, no return to the world of smaller sins and smaller hopes. This was the cusp of something enormous and terrifying. A new path that would twist and turn, forging a legend or a calamity, or both. Daenerys had been sleeping in a smaller side of the tent, for Drogo's fever had unsettled him, and the Dothraki believed a sick Khal's spirit needed space to fight off the darkness alone. When Jorah came for her, she rose in a swirl of silver hair, her violet eyes shining with worry. It was the look of a woman who had learned to keep her fear hidden but never banished. Jorah remembered the trembling of her arm when he told her. He recalled the note of heartbreak and horror when she realized he had ended the life of her husband. She had sagged against him in stunned silence. In the hours that followed, the Khalasar had discovered the truth. Some said Drogo died of the fever. Others, half-blinded by grief, suspected foul play. The Blood Riders roared, beating their chests and demanding to see Drogo's body. Daenerys wept, and Jorah hovered by her side, knowing that if her tears were taken for weakness, the men might turn on her. So, with little time to plan and no illusions of an easy path, Jorah gathered all the strength he could muster. The next morning, he insisted Daenerys walk out amongst the Khalasar, tall and proud, to declare Drogo's final will. He was, after all, her sun and stars. If she didn't show them enough strength, she would lose everything. Daenerys walked slowly, barefoot, letting her silver hair fall loose around her shoulders. Though she seemed fragile as a reed, something steely glimmered behind her tears. Jorah kept his sword belt tightened around his hips, hand near the hilt, ready to defend her. To his astonishment, the Khalasar parted for her. Many gazed at her with confusion, some with mistrust, and a few with outright rage. She stood in front of the smoldering coals of a dying fire, the red glow of embers reminding her of a dragon's breath. She spoke in halting Dothraki, words she had studied so diligently, proclaiming Khal Drogo's final wish, that his Khaleesi lead them to a new future, that she would birth the stallion who would mount the world, and all would ride beneath her name. If Drogo had truly, in his last hours, anointed her, no one would question her right to lead. That was the story Jorah carefully spun, whispering it into the ears of those who might become allies. Yet the tradition of the Dothraki was harsh. When a Khal dies, his khalasar fragments. Blood riders claim their own followings, forging new loyalties. Maras break away from the herd. A foreign woman, would not hold them together. Some might remain out of devotion, but many would desert. The question was not if they would break, but when and how violently. Daenerys bowed her head, trembling. Jorah could almost sense the men turning away. The tent flaps rustled in the breeze, whispering with the swirl of sands. He feared he had led her to ruin. But then Daenerys lifted her chin. She touched her rounded belly, cradling the life inside her. She called out the names of those who had stood by Drogo from the earliest days. She invoked the memory of Drogo's strength, his promise to cross the sea, to conquer. She reminded them all of how no other Khal had been so bold as to set sights beyond the grasslands, how no other Khal had truly listened to the words of a foreign bride who spoke of iron chairs and western seas. There was a strange hush among the Dothraki as she spoke. A wind passed, ruffling manes of horses. As if from a distance, Jorah heard the keening wails of women for the loss of their Khal. Still, Daenerys' voice was strong. She declared that she would continue Drogo's legacy, that she would not simply remain a grieving widow but fulfill the prophecy of the stallion who mounts the world. A few men stirred in grudging acknowledgement. They had followed Drogo a long time, and there was a flicker of curiosity in their eyes. She was, after all, carrying his heir. When she finished, the silence stretched taut. Jorah felt his heart pounding, each beat a hammer blow. Then one of the younger riders began to pound his arak against his chest. Another joined in, a few more. The remainder stood uncertain, not yet convinced. But in that moment, Daenerys Targaryen, the silver-haired Khaleesi, was not cast out or devoured by the swirling sands of Dothraki tradition. She had, at least, a fragile acceptance among some portion of the khalasar. That fragile acceptance was tested immediately. Kotho, one of Drogo's blood riders, stepped forward with a sneer on his lips. He was tall and rangy, with a cruel set to his jaw that Jorah had never trusted. His eyes flicked to Jorah's sword, then back to Daenerys. He spat in the dust, proclaiming that a dead Khal's blood riders belonged to the grave, that their lives ended with his. What right had a foreign girl to claim them now? He called her a usurper, a whore who bewitches strong men. The hush turned dangerous. A few men barked in Kotho's favor, while others frowned in confusion. Jorah stepped forward and placed a protective hand on Daenerys' shoulder. She did not recoil. Instead, she lifted her chin to Kotho and said, "I do not ask for your life. I do not ask for your loyalty. I only speak my husband's will." But Kotho was not moved by pleas or half-measures. He twisted the handle of his arak and spoke of ancient Dothraki law, how a Khal's widow was free to remain among them as a Khalasar or go to Viz Dothrak, where she might live out her days with the Dash Khaleen. But lead the Khalasar? That was not tradition. That was not allowed. He claimed it would bring a curse upon them all. A hiss of agreement rippled through those men who worshipped tradition above all else. Jorah could sense the moment slipping away. He gripped the hilt of his sword. He did not want more bloodshed, not so soon, but he knew that Kotho was goading Daenerys. If she appeared weak, she would lose them. If she commanded Jorah to cut down Kotho, it might force the rest to kneel, if fear was enough to bind them. Daenerys' eyes flitted over the faces of the Khalasar. She trembled, but not from fear alone. She mourned Drogo still. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but her voice rang out again. "You speak of curses," she said, her Dothraki better now, each word carved from the air like a blade. But Khal Drogo believed in breaking curses, in forging new paths. "If you stay with me, I will not take away your traditions. I will bring you," and here her voice caught, as she remembered her child's promise. "I will bring you the world." Kotho was unmoved. He spat once more. Then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged. Whether to seize her or to demonstrate her weakness, Jorah never knew. What he did know was that he had faced men like Kotho before. Men with steel in their hearts and no moral chain to hold them back. Jorah's sword flashed, and in a heartbeat, Kotho was lying on the ground, blood pooling in the dusty earth. Perhaps Jorah's blade had found Kotho's throat. Perhaps the retainer had stumbled into it in the rush. The moment was a swirl of dust and steel, adrenaline screaming in Jorah's veins. A cry went up among the onlookers. Some roared in anger, some in shock. A few stared wide-eyed. Then, a hush like the absence of wind on a boiling day. Daenerys Targaryen stood with her knight, and at her feet was Kotho's body. She closed her eyes, and Jorah felt her shoulder shake beneath his hand. He wanted to offer comfort, but he knew he must project unwavering strength in front of these warriors. In that hush, another voice rang out. Rakaro, a young rider who had once taught Daenerys how to seat a horse in the Dothraki style, shouted that the Khaleesi was under his protection now. Irri and Jiki, her handmaidens, still believed she was the mother of the stallion who mounts the world. A cluster of riders followed suit, some because they feared Jorah's sword, others because they had come to admire this foreign woman who had stood beside Drogo in his last days. The Khalasar had not yet scattered, but fractures were forming, splinters that would break away soon. That night, a council of sorts convened around the main fire. Jorah stood behind Daenerys, arms crossed over his chest, scanning the ring of faces. A few of Drogo's old blood riders had fled already, taking some portion of the Khalasar with them. Others lingered, uncertain whether to stay or go. The only thing that remained constant was the hush of the night wind and the flicker of flames. Over the course of hours, Daenerys spoke of the future. She spoke of crossing the narrow sea, forging alliances, reclaiming the Iron Throne of Westeros. Some Dothraki scoffed at the notion of ships, but others found a wild thrill in the idea of plundering beyond the known horizon. The air was rife with unspoken tensions. One word, one misstep, and the entire camp might erupt into bloodshed. Finally, in the small hours before dawn, the largest fraction of the Khalasar made its choice. They would remain for now under Daenerys' leadership, but if she did not prove her strength soon, if the new path ended in false promises, they would ride away. Many demanded she travel to Viz Dothrak with them and undergo the rites of the Dash Khaleen. They would see if the crones who read omens among the stalls of the holy city recognized her place. But Daenerys refused to linger there as a widow. She promised them a new horizon, the one Drogo had vowed to conquer. In the swirl of conflicting demands, Jorah knew it would be impossible to keep them all. But a start was a start. He watched Daenerys' profile in the firelight, the flush of heat on her cheeks, the line of exhaustion etched on her brow. He thought of how young she truly was and how little choice life had given her. His heart ached with tenderness. He would have thrown himself into the flames to keep her from harm. In a way, he already had by taking Drogo's life, by severing her from the traditional path she might have walked. When the sun rose, it lit a new reality. Khal Drogo's funeral pyre was prepared, though with none of the fanfare that might have accompanied a mighty Khal's departure if he had died in the fullness of his strength. Still, Daenerys oversaw the placement of his body herself, gently veiling his face in a cloth embroidered with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Jorah saw the tears she tried to hide, felt the tremors in her hands as she smoothed the cloth over Drogo's still features. That was the man who had been her sun and stars, who had shown her kindness in a cruel land. Yet Jorah's dagger had ended him. Her sorrow was a wound Jorah feared might never heal. All that day, the pyre stood, a silent reminder of what had been lost. Some Dothraki came to offer tributes, bits of braided hair, polished bone charms, small tokens of loyalty or grief. Others whispered curses or spat insults. Daenerys bore it all with a stillness that belied her tempest of emotions. Jorah rarely left her side, mindful of any sudden challenge. But the day passed without a confrontation. Some of the Dothraki fed their horses, some packed their tents to leave before dark. By dusk, the crowd around the pyre was thinner than it had been in the morning. Daenerys stood amidst the drifting smoke, her hair catching the last threads of sunlight. Jorah stayed a pace behind her, hand never far from his sword, torn between duty and guilt. At last, Daenerys gave the signal. With a torch lit from a brazier, she limped forward. So weary, It was almost as if she were carrying the weight of worlds. She touched the flame to the piled tinder, and it caught with a roar. The desert wind whipped the fire into frenzied shapes, flickers of orange and gold dancing over Drogo's form. From a safe distance, some watchers murmured, half expecting new horrors, half expecting wonders. They had not forgotten that the Khaleesi had once embraced strange magic to try to save her husband. She was tainted, some said, with the blood of witches. Others believed she was blessed, her unborn child destined for greatness. The flames soared higher. Daenerys did not move away. The fire painted her face with shifting shadows, a swirl of sorrow and fierce resolve. Jorah moved closer, alarmed at how near she stood to the blaze. He recalled the old stories she had whispered, how the blood of the dragon runs hot, how Targaryens are said to be immune to fire. He did not believe in such legends wholeheartedly, yet he had seen glimpses of a terrible, wondrous truth in Daenerys before. She took a step forward, the scorching heat blooming around her. At first, Jorah reached out to drag her back, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was something primal, a melding of grief and destiny. She did not waver. She took another step. Flames licked around her, teased strands of her silver hair. Jorah's heart thudded in his chest. He wondered, in a moment of madness, if she would burn alive or if some miracle would spare her. Daenerys continued forward until she stood right beside the pyre, so close that Jorah could hardly see her through the shifting veil of heat and smoke. He clenched his hands into fists and forced himself to remain still. This was her choice. If she was truly the dragon, then let the flames prove it. If not, he felt his stomach twist at the thought of her death. Suddenly, she let out a single, keening cry, a sound so raw it seemed to crack open the evening sky. Jorah saw her silhouette wreathed in swirling sparks, a motionless figure of silver hair and trembling limbs. The heat was overwhelming, stinging his eyes. Then he heard something else, a cracking, splintering noise from within the fire. At first, he thought it was the timber snapping. Then he realized it was the eggs. The dragon eggs, the ones that had been gifted to Daenerys at her wedding. She had placed them with Drogo's body. A second keening cry tore the air. This one not from Daenerys, but from something else. Jorah's heart hammered as he gazed into the inferno. He saw something moving, shifting, alive within those flames. A shape or shapes, slithering free of blackened shells. Dragons. The word pounded in his mind. Impossible, yet here they were. Tiny creatures no larger than a cat, the color of ash and smoke and molten rock, uncoiling in the flames. When the blaze finally ebbed, Jorah took a trembling step forward. The heat was still ferocious, but the wind had shifted, and through the dissipating smoke, he saw her. Daenerys Targaryen, naked, unburnt, the remnants of her clothes a smoldering ruin at her feet. And clinging to her shoulders and arms were the newborn dragons. One clutched her hair, another clung to her thigh, a third perched at the crook of her neck. It was a sight so foreign, so awe-inspiring that Jorah dropped to one knee, tears burning his eyes. Around him, any Dothraki who had not already departed fell silent. Those who remained sank to their knees as well, stunned by the miracle. She stood among them, the unburnt mother of dragons, a goddess in the flesh. Though this was the same night she originally birthed her dragons in the other timeline, the circumstances were altogether different. Khal Drogo had not died in slow agony, but by Jorah's hand, a mercy killing or a sacrilege, depending on one's view. The Khalasar was already fragmented, scattered by confusion and suspicion. Yet in that instant, the sight of Daenerys unburnt, crowned by living dragons, recalibrated the Dothraki's entire belief system. She was no ordinary widow, no meek foreign bride. She was the breaker of chains yet to be realized, the mother of dragons, the embodiment of prophecy. Some of those who had turned away came crawling back in wonder. Those who had decided to ride off that very night found their resolve rattled. Many returned, whispering that they had glimpsed the sign of a new age. Jorah rose to his feet slowly, approaching her with caution. The dragons hissed at him, small tongues flicking the air. Daenerys raised a hand and the creatures quieted, though they still eyed him warily. She looked at Jorah with tears streaking her cheeks. He felt his throat tighten. He wanted to beg her forgiveness, but he didn't know if he deserved it. He had stolen her the chance to see if Drogo might recover, to share a life with him a little longer. He had also, perhaps, saved her from the savage betrayals that might have followed. In that instant, under the drifting smoke and emerging stars, she spoke softly, "You gave me a terrible mercy, Ser Jorah. I don't know if I can ever forgive or forget, but you have served me and you have saved me. I cannot cast you aside." He bowed his head. "I will follow you anywhere, my queen." She heard the sincerity in his voice. He saw it reflected in her shining eyes. It did not erase the tension or heartbreak, but it laid the foundation for a new bond, forged in the flames of that pyre. And so began the strange new path. Daenerys, no longer Drogo's Khaleesi, but a widow unburnt, a mother of dragons, with a splintered Khalasar trying to decide if she truly was worthy of their worship. The next day, men and women came to see her new children, to gawk or to murmur prayers. She took a cloak from one of her handmaidens and draped it around her shoulders. Her hair had burned away in places, but the scalp itself was unscorched, the Targaryen blood of the dragon proven. The hatchlings nipped at each other and at her, sometimes with little squeaks. Daenerys endured their tiny bites and sharp claws with surprising equanimity, as though she considered the pain part of her penance and part of her destiny. The council convened again. Many Dothraki had left, but enough remained to form a small but loyal Khalasar. Perhaps 100 warriors and their families, perhaps a bit more. The rest would roam the grasslands or seek new calls. Daenerys did not try to chase after them. She understood that for the Dothraki, a call who cannot ride is no call at all, and she was a woman leading them into uncharted territory. Instead, she gathered the faithful to plan their next move. They had supplies, horses, a scattering of wealth from Drogo's conquests, but hardly enough to storm Westeros. They needed resources. Jorah stood at her side, an ever-present shadow, offering his counsel. "We might seek out the free cities. With dragons, you could command attention. Perhaps Pentos or Volantis, somewhere we could rest and let your dragons grow." He eyed the little creatures with fascination. They were frail, wings still damp, mewling for food. Hardly the fearsome beasts of legend, yet. Daenerys listened, brow furrowed. She seemed torn between the desire to bring her wrath and her birthright upon Westeros at once, and the practicality that she needed time. In the old timeline, she might have begun with Karth or Astapor, forging alliances or crushing slave cities. But this time, her mind was shaped by the knowledge of how precarious her situation was. Jorah's betrayal of Drogo had earned her a measure of internal guilt. She wanted to prove herself worthy of the life taken. She wanted to show the Dothraki that she was a Khaleesi of strength, not just an inheritor of tragedy. She wanted, too, to carve her name into the bones of the world, so that Drogo's sacrifice, be it forced or fated, would not be in vain. Her first decision was to move east, away from the heart of the Dothraki Sea where other calls might challenge her. She led her people into the Red Waste, the scorching desert region that tested their endurance. Jorah dreaded it, but he obeyed, for she had the dragons. Small though they were, they seemed to breathe a flicker of purpose into the hearts of her followers. Day by day, they trekked across the cracked red earth, searching for oases, for any sign of safe passage. They lost horses to exhaustion, warriors to the unforgiving heat. Daenerys walked among them, refused to ride when others had to go on foot. She shared her water and her meager rations, showing a compassion that many found perplexing in a ruler. It was not the Dothraki way, but it softened some hearts, drew them closer to her in loyalty. In the endless scorch, Jorah learned more about Daenerys than he ever had before. He saw her weep silently for the infant dragons, worried they might starve if they did not find enough meat. He saw her slip away from the main camp at night, pressing her palms to her belly, murmuring prayers to whatever gods might listen. She was still with child, and the exertion of travel drained her dangerously. He saw the shadows under her eyes deepen as the days became weeks. He realized that she was forging herself anew in that crucible, that her old life as a timid sister under Viserys' bullying thumb was gone. She had stepped into a role no one had prepared her for, and it demanded everything of her, mind, body, and soul. He recalled an evening when, after a day of ceaseless sun, she collapsed by a meager fire, her lips cracked and bleeding. He offered her his water flask, the last swallow. She stared at him, face drawn. "You killed my sun and stars," she said quietly, not in anger, but in a voice so haunted he hardly recognized it. I am not ungrateful for what you've done, for perhaps I would be dead or worse if you hadn't acted. But sometimes, I can't help wondering what might have been. Jorah had no easy answer. He bowed his head, letting his shame speak for him. Then he whispered, I pray your child will be strong and healthy. That is all I want for you. She closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lashes. Yes, she said, brushing a hand over her belly. That is what I want too. For my child to be strong enough to survive all that I must do. And she leaned into him just for a moment, letting him cradle her exhausted form. The dragons were curled on a warm rock near the fire, making soft chirping noises, their scales gleaming like shards of onyx. She was forging a new family out of the ashes, and Jorah was uncertain where he belonged in it. But he knew he would guard her with his life. At last, the red waste yielded to a merciful sight on the horizon, a patch of green, faint and hazy, a promise of water. Spurred on by the hope of survival, Daenerys's followers pressed forward, carrying what remained of their supplies. The dragons, grown only slightly larger, flapped clumsily at times, mostly riding on her shoulders or in small baskets carried by her handmaidens. Jorah scouted ahead, sword always at the ready in case brigands or worse lurked in that oasis. As they drew closer, they realized it was no simple oasis but a small settlement built around a spring. A cluster of mud brick buildings, a handful of palm trees swaying in the hot wind. Upon spotting the approaching Khalasar, a few inhabitants fled indoors, bolting shutters. Others brandished crude spears. They were not a wealthy or powerful people, merely a settlement of hardy souls who had chosen to make a life in the fringes of the Red Waste. Daenerys called out to them in a mixture of Dothraki and Valyrian, explaining that she sought only water and shelter. Some recognized the dragons perched on her shoulders and grew frightened, crossing themselves or dropping their weapons. It took several days of careful negotiation, aided by the few gifts Daenerys could spare, before the settlement's leaders allowed the Dothraki to remain. They demanded that no horses trample their gardens, that the dragons be kept away from their livestock. Daenerys, with as much grace as she could manage, promised to respect their conditions. In that small settlement, Daenerys's Khalasar began to recover from the grueling desert crossing. They established a temporary camp on the outskirts, trading labor for food. Jorah noted that some riders grumbled about tending fields or hauling water, tasks they considered beneath them. But Daenerys insisted that if they were to remain, they needed to earn their keep. And so, the Dothraki, proud horselords, found themselves planting seeds and chopping wood, a sight that would have been unthinkable under Khal Drogo's rule. Some chafed at this new reality and left under the cover of darkness, riding west in search of another call. But a core group stayed, bound by the mesmerizing sight of the dragons, the unburnt Khaleesi, and a quiet sense that destiny might still lie with her. Slowly, their strength returned. Jorah used the time to spar with those who yearned for the warrior's path, to keep their skills sharp. Daenerys observed from a shaded spot, occasionally wincing from the aches of her pregnant body. She was drawing near to the time of her delivery, though none could say exactly when. Targaryen blood might carry certain mysteries after all, and the stress of the crossing had taken its toll. One sweltering morning, as Jorah was demonstrating a new sword technique to Ricardo, Daenerys approached with measured steps, one hand protectively on her belly. Ser Jorah, she said softly, will you walk with me? He handed his sword to Ricardo and followed her, uneasy at the strain in her voice. She led him to the shade of a palm tree near the settlement's well. I want to speak of what comes next, she told him, glancing at the dragons that lay dozing on a sunny rock. They are growing, but too slowly. My child is growing too, and soon. I will have responsibilities unlike any I've known. He nodded, bracing himself. We can't linger here forever. Sooner or later, some other call, or worse, may find us. We need allies, resources, a place to let the dragons thrive. She frowned, twisting her fingers in the fringe of her makeshift shawl. Yes, but the question is where? Westeros calls to me. My father's throne, though I never knew him, is my birthright. Yet I know that the 7 kingdoms are not waiting with open arms. If we arrive with a handful of riders and 3 infant dragons, we will be devoured. I have heard of the free cities where sellswords and magisters might be bought. I have heard of Slaver's Bay, though the thought of dealing with slavers makes my skin crawl. Khal Drogo once planned to buy ships in the east. Perhaps that is our path. Jorah studied her face. You would not go to Viz Dothrak to be among the Dashkaleen, then? Some might counsel that path. They might say you would earn the blessings of the old crones, so that no call could deny your significance. Her expression hardened. I am done being hidden away. waiting for others to decide my fate." She paused, her voice calmer. "But perhaps in time, I will return to V's Dothrak as a conqueror, not as a widow. For now, I think we must head south to the Jade Sea or east through the ancient trade routes. We will search for wealth, for support. And one day, we will come back west in force." Jorah inclined his head. "I stand by you, my queen. Wherever you choose, I will do all in my power to protect you." Her eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw gratitude, sadness, and something else he could not name. She said only, "Thank you, Ser Jorah." That settled, Daenerys began to prepare for the next stage of their journey. Her followers, numbering fewer than 300 souls by now, made ready to ride or march, gathering what supplies they could barter or purchase from the settlement. The local elder who oversaw the well demanded a steep price in the form of labor, which the Dothraki grudgingly provided. Over weeks, the small group re-equipped themselves, but fate would not let them depart so smoothly. On an evening when the sky was streaked with orange, Daenerys felt the first pangs of labor. Jorah, worried beyond measure, cleared out a small hut near the center of the settlement for her. The midwives among her followers came, bearing hot water and blankets, singing old Dothraki lullabies that Daenerys tried to follow with trembling lips. She clutched at Jorah's hand in the early hours of her labor, her nails biting into his palm. Fear etched her features. She had lost so much, her brother, her husband, her illusions. Would she lose this child, too? The labor stretched into the night. The midwives whispered of omens, some encouraging, some dark. The dragons hissed outside the hut, pacing, their long necks craning as if they sensed their mother's distress. Jorah stood vigil by the door, anxious and helpless. He had faced men in battle, faced the possibility of death dozens of times, but never felt such terror as when he heard Daenerys scream. She was all he had. He realized that truth with a pang of guilt, with a pang of devotion. He lived and breathed only to serve her, and if she died, he would have nothing. Hours became a blur. The midwives cried out commands in Dothraki. Hot compresses were applied to Daenerys's brow. One handmaiden offered her a rag soaked in strong liquor to bite down on, stifling her cries. Then, near dawn, there came a hush. A single, piercing wail broke it, a baby's cry. Jorah felt tears sting his eyes. The midwives chattered in astonishment. A boy, healthy, alive. Some murmured about the old prophecy, the stallion who mounts the world. Others dared not label the child so soon, for they had seen how prophecy could twist. Daenerys wept in relief, cradling her newborn son in trembling arms. He had a tuft of silver-white hair, skin flushed from the ordeal. Outside, the dragons raised their heads, releasing a series of shrill trills as if echoing the infant's cry. The Dothraki midwives took it as a sign. Jorah took it as a miracle. In that quiet hut, Daenerys pressed her lips to the baby's forehead and whispered, Rhaego, the name she had once chosen with Drogo. And at that moment, Jorah feared his heart would break. She was so full of love for her child, yet the father was gone, taken by Jorah's hand. But the heartbreak was overshadowed by joy and relief. Daenerys lived, and so did the child. For the next days, she rested, recovering her strength. The Khalasar celebrated in subdued fashion, uncertain if this birth truly heralded the stallion who would mount the world or if their future lay in forging a new legend. Either way, it was cause enough for them to remain united a little longer. Once Daenerys could walk without faltering, she gathered her followers, child in her arms, dragons perched around her. She declared that they would press onward, forging east to find the riches and alliances they needed. The settlement bid them goodbye with some small gifts, food, water, a few new spears. Jorah saw relief in the faces of the locals, happy to see the fearsome Dothraki depart. Yet he also saw a spark of wonder when they looked upon Daenerys and her brood of dragons. The world was changing, and even remote settlements on the edge of the Red Waste could sense it. The journey resumed, but now it was different. Daenerys carried not just her own hopes, but her infant son. He cried in the night, fussed at the jostling of the horse. When he fretted, the dragons cooed as if trying to soothe him. Daenerys was queen, mother, and caretaker all in one, and Jorah did what he could to help. He arranged a small cradle for Rhaego, rigging it so it could be carried by one of the more docile horses. He tried to keep watch at night, letting Daenerys snatch a few hours of sleep. His devotion did not go unnoticed by the Khalasar nor by Daenerys herself. Still, tension lay like a coiled serpent between them. Sometimes Daenerys's gaze would drift off, remembering Drogo. Sometimes in the hush of evening, Jorah would catch her wiping silent tears. She never spoke ill of him for his deed, nor did she thank him. It was an act that lay beyond gratitude or condemnation, an act that shaped everything. They wended their way past deserted caravans, half buried in sand, relics of old trade routes. Sometimes they encountered travelers who, upon seeing the dragons, exclaimed in awe or fear. Word began to spread of a silver-haired woman leading Dothraki across the wilderness with reptilian beasts perched on her shoulders. Rumors sprouted like weeds, traveling faster than the small Khalasar itself. One day, they stumbled upon a traveling caravan of merchant princes from Qarth, richly dressed in silks that shimmered under the sun. At first, these merchants were alarmed to see Dothraki riders approach. But when Daenerys dismounted, a dragon cradled in her arms, curiosity overcame their fear. They offered her gifts, a small cask of sweet wine, a length of fine cloth. She returned the gesture by letting them behold the other dragons, though she kept them close to her at all times. They spoke of Qarth, the great walled city by the Jade Gates, famed for its opulence and trickery in equal measure. The merchant princes insisted that Daenerys must come to Qarth. The city would marvel at her dragons, might even offer her patronage. Daenerys studied them warily. She remembered old stories that told of Qarth's wealth, but also of its cutthroat politics. She weighed her options. If she turned north, she might reach Pentos or Volantis eventually. But the deserts were harsh and the dragons still small. If she went south, Qarth stood as a glittering oasis of possibility. Jorah advised caution. Qarth is known for its illusions. The 13 merchant princes who rule can be as deadly as any sellsword. They may try to trap you, parade you as a curiosity. But they might also offer you the resources we need. Daenerys listened, lips pressed thin. We need a foothold somewhere. My child cannot wander the deserts forever. If Qarth is a den of serpents, well, so is the rest of the world. Perhaps it's time I learned to dance with them. And so they agreed to accompany the caravan. Jorah remained vigilant, speaking often with Ricardo and the other Dothraki warriors, reminding them not to let their guard down. The journey took several weeks. Through it all, Daenerys breastfed her son beneath a makeshift canopy on her horse, rocked him to sleep by the fire each night, and kept her dragons close, feeding them morsels of charred meat. The merchant princes observed every detail with keen, calculating eyes. When at last they neared Qarth, the great walls rose like ivory mountains against the horizon. Massive gates studded with gilded reliefs of strange creatures stood open, guarded by spearmen in lacquered armor. The city beyond shimmered with pastel towers, wide boulevards lined with statues, and hidden gardens where exotic flowers perfumed the air. To Daenerys, after so many months of desert and dust, it seemed a dream or a mirage. They were greeted by a delegation of Qarthine nobles dressed in lavish robes of turquoise and gold. At their head was a slender woman with painted lips and a tall, elaborate headdress. She introduced herself as Kaith of the Shadow, though the merchants whispered that she was a shadowbinder from High, a woman of arcane talents. She gazed upon Daenerys with eyes like deep wells. Then she turned her unsettling gaze upon Jorah, who felt a chill race down his spine. You have come far, Daenerys Stormborn, she said softly. And your dragons have come farther still. The arrival in Qarth was a swirl of wonders. Jorah could hardly keep track of the courtiers, the splendor of architecture, the labyrinth of halls and banquet rooms. They were offered lodging in the manse of Xaro Zoan Daxos, a flamboyant noble who claimed to be a great friend to travelers. He wrapped Daenerys in a silken shawl and cooed over her dragons, calling them little jewels of the world. Daenerys accepted his hospitality with cautious politeness. The Dothraki riders, unaccustomed to such grandeur, prowled the halls of Xaro's manse uneasily, hands never far from their araks. Meanwhile, Jorah inspected every corner, ensuring Daenerys' safety. Qarth's illusions soon revealed themselves. At a grand feast in her honor, Daenerys was flattered by noble after noble, each praising her beauty, her lineage, her dragons. Yet behind the praise lurked questions. Might she be willing to trade a dragon for a fabulous sum of gold? Might she lend her beasts to bolster a Qarthine expedition seeking new trade routes? Could she be convinced to marry into one of the 13 ruling families, sealing an alliance? She demurred with grace, offering only the promise that she sought mutual benefit. At her side, Jorah scowled at every mention of giving up a dragon. She would never sell her children, of that he was certain. Late one evening, as the festivities died down, Daenerys and Jorah walked through Xaro's courtyard garden. Torchlight danced on mosaic tiles, and a gentle breeze teased the night-blooming flowers into releasing their perfume. Daenerys' dragons were perched in the branches of a flowering tree, roosting for the night, their small forms almost camouflaged by blossoms. She held Rhaego in her arms, the baby asleep on her shoulder. Jorah took in the sight with a pang. She looked every inch a queen and a mother, radiant in the hush of starlight. She spoke softly, not looking at him. They call Qarth the greatest city that ever was or will be. But I have seen the slithering greed beneath the surface. He nodded. These merchant princes would sell their own mothers for a chance at profit. They see your dragons as the ultimate treasure. She brushed a hand over Rhaego's hair. Sometimes I wonder if I am strong enough to protect them all, my child, my dragons, my people. In the Dothraki Sea, everything was simpler, cruel but straightforward. Now I must navigate lies and courtesies. One misstep, and we could lose everything. Jorah bowed his head. My queen, you are not alone. You have me and you have your loyal riders. We will stand against Qarth if we must. She sighed. I know, but I cannot help remembering how it might have been with Drogo. Would he have bludgeoned his way through these halls? Taken by force what I now must coax with words? Perhaps we would be unstoppable. Or perhaps we would be undone even faster. I cannot escape that question. Yet I have no choice but to go on. He hesitated, then gently touched her arm. You can mourn the path not taken, Daenerys, but do not let it eclipse the path ahead. We stand on the brink of something extraordinary. The dragons will grow, your son will grow, and you will grow. Let the memory of Khal Drogo guide you, but do not let it chain you. A sheen of tears glistened in her eyes, but she smiled faintly. Thank you, Ser Jorah. You speak wisely. She gazed at her sleeping child, and the faint coos of her dragons overhead. We will forge a better future, for all of us. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys attempted to secure backing from the Qartheen. She visited the palatial residences of the 13, endured their fawning and their offers. She refused to bargain away even one dragon, no matter how lavish the sum. Jorah sensed her frustration. Many would vow help only if she parted with a dragon. She was forced to rely on smaller trades, using a portion of Drogo's old spoils to buy food and lodging for her followers. Xaro Xhoan Daxos proposed marriage, promising her half the wealth of Qarth in exchange for a single dragon. She refused, gently but firmly. That night, Xaro wept theatrically in the garden, lamenting her ingratitude. As her resources dwindled, Daenerys grew increasingly wary. She spoke to Jorah about leaving Qarth before they became prisoners of politics. We can travel farther east, perhaps to Ass High, she suggested. But he frowned, recalling the grim tales of Ass High and its shadowed labyrinths. He advised her that it might be far more dangerous than Qarth. Their dilemma deepened when word reached them of a new threat in the city. Certain factions feared Daenerys' dragons might upset the balance of power. Rumors circulated that an attempt on her life might be imminent. Alarmed, Jorah doubled the guard around her quarters. The Dothraki bristled, eager for a fight. Daenerys ordered them to remain calm, not to provoke open conflict. But tension simmered like a pot about to boil. One moonless night, as Daenerys tried to snatch a bit of restless sleep, an assassin crept into the manse. Jorah, on high alert, spotted the shadow slipping along the colonnade. He confronted the intruder, sword drawn. They clashed, steel ringing in the hush. Jorah managed to wound the assassin, who dropped a wickedly curved dagger. The intruder hissed in a language Jorah did not recognize, then fled over the courtyard wall, disappearing into the darkness. By the time the Dothraki mobilized, it was too late. Daenerys, awakened by the sound of steel, found Jorah breathing hard, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his shoulder. Her face blanched with fear as she realized how close a call it had been. The next day, Daenerys demanded answers from Xaro Xhoan Daxos and the other Qartheen. Who had sent the assassin? The merchant princes feigned ignorance, each blaming the other. Kaith appeared mysteriously in Daenerys' chambers, murmuring cryptic warnings about illusions and betrayals. Daenerys had had enough. She informed her Khalasar they would depart Qarth immediately. The city gates, however, were closed to her at first under the pretext of protecting Qarth from the unpredictable beasts she harbored. Only after a tense standoff did the gates open, spurred by the presence of Dothraki outriders ready to burn the outer markets. So the small entourage left Qarth behind, traveling north along the coast. Jorah guided them as best he could, though the route was uncertain. Their aim was to eventually circle back westward, stopping in trading ports where Daenerys might secure a ship or a small fleet. The dragons were growing a little each day, but they remained far from the unstoppable force of legend. Meanwhile, Rhaego thrived, babbling in babyish coos that Daenerys answered with affectionate murmurs. Every time Jorah saw mother and child together, his resolve to protect them at all costs only hardened. Yet in quiet moments, doubt gnawed at him. He had changed Daenerys' fate irrevocably by slaying Drogo. Would she have been safer following the original path? Would the prophecy of her still coming true have shaped itself differently? He only knew that he could not undo it. He could only strive, day by day, to ensure she survived and eventually triumphed. In the months that followed, Daenerys' Khalasar arrived at a port city along the Jade Sea. It was smaller than Qarth, less grand, but still bustling with ships that carried spice, silk, and metals. There, after much negotiation, Daenerys purchased passage on several vessels for her people and horses. The ships were old and creaking, but the captain, a weathered man with scarred cheeks, offered them a fair price for their meager coin. The Dothraki eyed the ships with suspicion, for they loathed the water. But Daenerys insisted. She reminded them of Drogo's vow to cross the poison water to conquer new lands. If they were truly loyal, they would honor the dream. Reluctantly, they boarded. Horses stamped and neighed in panic, requiring sedation and gentle handling. The dragons squawked at the rolling decks, flapping their wings in alarm. Daenerys stood at the prow of the lead ship, baby Rhaego wrapped against her chest, staring out across the foaming waves with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Jorah stood beside her, the wind ruffling what hair he had. "We're finally crossing the sea," he said, wonder in his voice. She nodded, hugging Rhaego closer. "Yes. It seems everything Drogo spoke of, the wooden horses that swim the salt waves, was not just a dream. We have begun to shape our own reality, Ser Jorah. And the shape of it might cast a long shadow." Behind them, the sun slipped below the horizon. The smell of salt filled the air. Daenerys' dragons perched on the rails, screeching at seagulls. The small flotilla sailed onward, bearing the exiled queen, her newborn heir, her battered Khalasar, and 3 young dragons who might one day challenge the balance of the world. In Westeros, across the narrow sea, few yet realized how this shift in events would echo. The news would arrive piecemeal, rumors of a silver-haired woman with dragons who had bypassed Slaver's Bay, who had clashed with Qarth and left it in uproar, who traveled with a Dothraki Khalasar loyal to her newborn son. The lords of the 7 kingdoms were busy with their own squabbles. The War of the 5 Kings loomed or was already underway, depending on how time aligned. The north was stirring under Robb Stark, the south under the Lannisters, Stannis and Renly each making their claims. Few had the clarity to see that a new player with fire made flesh was charting a path around the world's edges, gathering knowledge, forging alliances. One day, perhaps soon, Daenerys Storborn would turn her gaze back toward that broken realm. She would come bearing dragons large enough to blot out the sun, an heir whose father was the mightiest Khal and a knight who had committed the ultimate sin out of love and loyalty. The realm would tremble at the sound of her name, though it did not yet know it should. And in the quiet corners of her soul, Daenerys would still grieve for her son and stars. She would still recall the moment when her protector, Ser Jorah Mormont, had driven a blade into Drogo's heart to spare her a darker fate. She would carry that memory as both wound and shield, letting it sharpen her resolve, letting it remind her of the price of survival. Through storms and betrayal, across deserts and seas, she would press forward, forging a new destiny that only the dragons could foretell. For though she had not walked the same path, had not lit the same pyre with the same impetus, had not watched Drogo waste away until the Maegie's black magic twisted everything, she had, in the end, emerged unburnt. She had birthed dragons under the night sky. She had become a mother not just to Rhaego but to mythical creatures who would shape the course of kingdoms. And at her side, the knight who loved her with a devotion that defied reason. Whatever lay ahead, whatever wars or alliances or heartbreaks, the world would know her name. Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons, widow of Khal Drogo, queen-in-waiting. And behind that name, in the hush of memory, would always linger the whisper of steel-cutting flesh, of a life stolen to protect a life yet to blossom. She would never forget that Jorah Mormont had killed Khal Drogo for her sake. Nor would she ever let that sacrifice be in vain. One day, she vowed silently, she would stand upon the shores of Westeros, dragons groan and war drums pounding, her son at her side, and claim the birthright so many had denied. She would show the world the fire in her veins, the unyielding will in her heart. She would show them all what it meant to be Targaryen. And perhaps, beneath it all, some corner of her heart might forgive Jorah or might not. But the time for that reckoning was not yet. For now, they sailed onward, forging a future that no prophecy had fully charted, and the song of ice and fire changed its course, like a river meeting a fresh tide, flowing into unknown seas. They sailed away from the heat and glitter of Qarth under a sky the color of dull iron. Daenerys stood at the prow of the lead ship with her sleeping infant son bound close to her chest and her 3 young dragons perched around her feet, blinking at the wind. It was not one of the grand vessels she had glimpsed in the Qarthine harbors, all proud sails and polished rails. These were trade ships of modest size, their hulls battered by countless voyages. Yet Daenerys felt a tremor of possibility each time the deck rolled beneath her. She was no longer beholden to the fickle welcome of Qarth. She was free. The next shore would be of her own choosing, and the next steps would be her own as well. Ser Jorah Mormont stood a short distance behind her, his hand on the hilt of his sword, gray-brown hair ruffled by the breeze. The Dothraki huddled below decks or by the aft rail, uncomfortable upon the water. They were far from their beloved horses, far from any comfortable notion of the vast plains. Yet these were the riders who had remained loyal to Daenerys, drawn to her by awe and perhaps a budding faith that her dragons would someday be fearsome. The remainder of Khal Drogo's Khalasar had scattered back across the Dothraki Sea, unwilling or unable to believe in a foreign Khaleesi who had lived when her sun and stars did not. Rhaego, safe against Daenerys's breast, stirred and gave a fretful whimper as the wind changed. She stroked his soft silver hair, aware that he was still so small in a world that expected so much of him. He was the child of prophecy, some said, the stallion who mounts the world, the son of a Khal and the blood of House Targaryen. Yet Daenerys had begun to wonder if the true stallion who mounts the world was not the child but the bond she now formed between Dothraki riders, her own Targaryen heritage, and the dragons that would one day blot out the sky with their wings. The old prophecies were as fluid as the ocean around her. She heard soft talons scraping across the deck. One of her dragons, the greenish-bronze one with a serpentine neck and bright eyes, hopped onto the ship's railing. She had named him Regal in memory of her brother Rhaegar, who had died on the Trident long ago. The smallest, white and gold, she called Viserion for the brother she had loved and feared. And the largest, black as night with red-tinged wings, was Drogon, named for her husband, the mighty Khal whose blood had once kept her safe. She remembered how Jorah's blade had ended Drogo's life to save her from that same Khal's delirium and from the potential wrath of his bloodriders. The memory hovered like a half-healed wound she could not help prodding. The wind carried a tang of salt as they pulled away from Qarth, the city's pale walls fading behind them. Xaro Zoan Daxos had pleaded for Daenerys to remain, offering luxuries, jewels, even half his rumored fortune if only she would give him a dragon in trade. She had refused. The dragons were her children, as dear to her as the infant in her arms. She would never surrender them to the ambitions of a Qarthine merchant prince. Instead, she chose to take her followers and whatever provisions she could purchase with her limited coin, setting sail for more distant shores. She did not know precisely where she would land. The Jade Sea was vast, the coasts of Essos south and east of Qarth offered dozens of ports, though many were small or hostile. Sailors warned her of the corsairs of the Basilisk Isles, the perils of Sithorios, the ancient ruins that dotted the coast. Ser Jorah urged caution, well aware that each new land could hold as many enemies as Qarth. But Daenerys believed that forward was their only course. She would not stay idle, waiting for the next assassin to creep through a window at night. In the first days, the voyage was manageable. The weather held calm, and Daenerys kept mostly to the deck, letting Rhaego breathe the warm ocean air. Her Dothraki eyed the rolling waves with hostility, but they trusted her enough to remain. If the sea claimed them, it would claim them together. Nights were still, broken only by the distant calls of seabirds and the creak of timbers. Daenerys would lie awake on her narrow bunk, Rhaego curled beside her, the dragons scattered at her feet like living coals, and she wondered at the roads ahead. Sometimes she dreamt of the Iron Throne in Westeros, an ugly, spiked seat that she had never seen except in half-remembered stories. She dreamt of her father, Mad King Aerys, though the dream never revealed his face. She dreamt of Drogo's strong arms, the weight of his presence. In the darkness, she would wake to find only her child and the hush of the sea. But soon the weather turned. A squall blew in from the south, lashing the ships with sleeting rain and high winds. Waves hammered at the hull, and the Dothraki retched miserably over the sides, cursing this cursed water that refused to stay still beneath their feet. Daenerys kept Rhaego warm in a sling beneath her cloak, while Jorah and her bloodriders did their best to help the sailors keep the ships from capsizing. Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal squawked and clung to the rigging, their wings pinned tight to their backs to avoid being torn off by the wind. More than once, Daenerys feared for them. In her nightmares, she saw one of her dragons carried away by the gale, flung into the watery depths. Yet the storm relented at last, leaving them battered but alive. The Dothraki marveled at having survived. Perhaps, they began to think, the foreign Khaleesi had the blessing of stronger gods than they had known. A few days later, a rumor spread among the ship's crews that they neared the first of the Basilisk Isles, a region infamous for slavers, pirates, and sellsword companies that established ephemeral strongholds. Daenerys had little desire to linger in such treacherous waters, but water supplies were running low and one of the ships needed to patch leaks from the storm. Eventually, Ser Jorah and the lead captain advised anchoring at a small cove near one of the lesser isles away from the main pirate dens. There, the crews might repair the hulls, refill their barrels at a freshwater spring, and gather fruit to stave off scurvy. When they arrived, the cove proved a narrow inlet lined with tall, jagged rocks, but calm enough to drop anchor. Jungle crept right to the shoreline, an explosion of green, thick vines, and distant bird calls. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation. Daenerys assembled a landing party, Jorah, a dozen Dothraki warriors, and several of the more trustworthy sailors. She left the majority of the Khalasar aboard the ships, guarding Rhaego and the dragons. Rhaego was old enough to notice his mother leaving, and he let out a plaintive cry. Daenerys' heart twisted, but she believed it was best to keep him safe on the ship. The Basilisk Isles were no place for an infant. She placed him in the Caraviri, one of her longtime handmaidens, and allowed the dragons to remain as well for fear that they might stray into the jungle and never return. As soon as Daenerys set foot on the island's shore, the stifling heat pressed down on her like a physical weight. The Dothraki around her muttered about the thick, damp air that clung to their skin. Jorah surveyed the tree line warily. With so much cover, it would be easy for brigands or pirates to ambush them. They had no illusions that this was a safe harbor. Still, necessity drove them forward. A narrow path led up from the cove to higher ground where the sailors claimed fresh water might be found. The group moved in a wary column, every ear straining for suspicious sounds. The foliage teemed with life, chittering monkeys, squawking bright-feathered birds, insects that hummed in maddening choruses. Vines hung from twisted trunks, draping over the path in loops. It was a world away from the sweeping grass sea of Dothraki lands or the polished courts of Karth. They had gone perhaps a mile inland when they reached a small clearing dominated by a shallow pool of water fed by a trickle from mossy rocks. The sailors tested it, swishing the water in a bucket. Fresh enough, they pronounced. The Dothraki led the horses to drink while others set down casks to fill. Daenerys stood by, her mind half on Rhaego's safety back on the ship and half on the uneasy hush that had fallen over the jungle. The bird calls had stilled as if in warning. A moment later, an arrow whined out of the foliage, striking one of the sailors in the shoulder. He reeled back with a cry. Chaos erupted. The Dothraki roared, brandishing their araks. More arrows came, slicing through the leaves with lethal whistles. Jorah barked for Daenerys to take cover behind a rocky outcrop, but she had already dropped to a crouch, fumbling for a dagger. The clearing exploded with movement as armed figures emerged from the brush, ragged men and women with tan skin wearing mismatched scraps of leather, brandishing spears and shortbows. Their eyes gleamed with a desperate ferocity. Daenerys' Dothraki needed no urging to fight. Araks flashed in the dimness, curved steel meeting the crude weapons. Of the ambushers, the pirate band, or whatever they were, realized too late they had stumbled upon riders far more deadly than the average merchant's guard. Screams echoed through the clearing. Jorah lunged forward, his sword cleaving a path. He reached Daenerys' side, panting, his eyes scanning for any threat to her. She pressed her back against the mossy stone, heart pounding. She was no stranger to violence, but the closeness of this ambush, the immediacy of the swirling blades and arrow shafts, set her pulse racing with a potent mix of fear and fury. One of the attackers lunged at her, a tall woman in a ragged tunic, brandishing a curved dagger. Daenerys' breath caught. She managed to raise her own blade, a small dagger Jorah had given her long ago, but it would not be enough. In that instant, Irie's voice filled her mind. "You are blood of the dragon." The attacker's face was feral, but her eyes flicked with surprise as Daenerys ducked beneath the slash. Jorah was there an instant later, driving his longsword through the pirate's side. The woman gasped and crumpled, the dagger spinning from her fingers. Daenerys felt a wave of nausea, but clung to composure. All around, the Dothraki quickly gained the upper hand. They had lost one man to an arrow in the throat and 2 more nursed wounds, but the pirates fell in greater numbers. Within minutes, the survivors scattered into the jungle. Daenerys clutched at Jorah's arm, trying to steady her breathing, scanning for any more hidden foes. The Dothraki whooped their victory, though blood spattered the ground. When the fighting stopped, they were left with a single survivor, a young man pinned beneath a Dothraki Zarak. A swirl of tattoos covered his forearms and fear contorted his features. Daenerys ordered the Dothraki to hold him but not kill him, hoping they might glean some insight into what threats lay deeper on the island. Jorah questioned him, speaking in several tongues. The captive answered haltingly in a rough dialect of Low Valyrian, eyes darting around for any chance of escape. He claimed there were more of them, a band of exiled warriors, escaped slaves, and pirates who harried any unlucky travelers that came ashore. Their leader was a man called Azaddon, a Selax from the Shadowlands, rumored to dabble in dark sorcery. They raided out of desperation and greed alike. Daenerys realized that, had her party been less prepared, they might have been slaughtered or dragged off as plunder. She studied the captive's trembling hands, the misery etched in his face, and felt a twinge of pity. This man and his group were half-starved, existing on robbery to survive. Yet they had tried to kill her men. After some deliberation, she commanded that he be released with a warning. "Tell your leader," she said, her voice steady, "that the blood of the dragon will not be spilled so easily. We will leave these shores soon enough, but any further attacks will end in death." The captive stared in confused awe at the silver-haired woman who wore no crown yet spoke like a queen. The mention of dragons likely mystified him further. Bowing in relief, he stumbled away into the underbrush. They refilled the water casks under the watchful eyes of the Dothraki, then retreated to the ships carrying their wounded. Daenerys inspected each wound with anxious eyes, ensuring that the men would live. She felt an echo of anger. The Basilisk Isles were known for cruelty, yes, but she could not abide any more blood spilled at the expense of her people. The moment she climbed the gangplank of the ship that carried her child, Drogo began to wail, as if sensing the tension. She scooped him up, pressing her face to his soft cheek. Jorah approached, frowning at the shallow cut along his own forearm. He had scarcely noticed it in the heat of the fight. "We should depart this cove as soon as possible," Jorah advised. "If that brigand rallies others for a second attack, they may come at us in small boats or try to burn our ships from shore." Daenerys agreed, though she felt weary to her core. She instructed the captains to weigh anchor immediately, even though the hull repairs were incomplete. Better to risk the sea than remain in a den of vipers. Within the hour, they pushed back out into open water, the Basilisk Isle fading into the horizon amid jagged rocks and creeping jungle. The men who had died in the fight were given over to the sea. Dothraki custom demanded a funeral pyre, but with no fuel or time to spare, Daenerys offered the waves in place of flame. The living cast handfuls of salt water, chanting under their breath. In the days that followed, Daenerys nursed her wounded, supervised the distribution of the meager supplies, and tried to focus on forging a plan. Rhaego's cries at night stabbed at her heart, making it hard to rest. She conferred with the sailors often, seeking knowledge of the next potential port or safe harbor. Most recommended they veer north, skirting the lands near New Guise, then cross over to the old Valyrian Peninsula's southwestern coast. There were lesser city-states there, forgotten or overshadowed by the 9 free cities further west, but they might serve as a stepping stone. Any route leading through Slaver's Bay was dangerous. The cities of Astapor, Ukai, and Meereen thrived on the flesh trade, and all had armies of their own. If Daenerys approached them without cunning, she might be enslaved herself or forced to make deals that would stain her conscience forever. Slavery. The very thought made Daenerys' jaw clench. She remembered how her brother Viserys had spoken of selling her if he could not find a wealthy husband to buy her. She remembered the wretched conditions of those she had glimpsed even among the Dothraki, captives from raids, forced to labor or worse. She had no wish to tangle with slavers unless it was to break their chains. But how could she do that with so few warriors, so little coin? Even her dragons, precious as they were, remained small enough to ride on her shoulders. They could hiss and breathe flickers of flame, but they could not yet raise a city. While she debated these worries, the ships continued their slow passage. The storms grew less frequent as they moved west, but the sea was far from gentle. Several times, Daenerys spied ominous sails in the distance, perhaps pirates or other reavers, though none approached closely enough to threaten. Ser Jorah took no chances, standing ready with the Dothraki, who glowered out at the waves, hungry for a fight. At last, after nearly 2 moons of grueling travel, their little fleet reached the fringes of the Gulf of Grief, the notorious waters that led into Slaver's Bay. To the far south rose the coast of Sithorios, a land of rumor and monstrous beasts. To the north loomed the edges of Old Guise, once an empire that rivaled Valyria before the Doom. Daenerys considered turning north, away from the slavers' strongholds. But her provisions were nearly gone, and it had been many days since they'd had fresh water or fruit. Morale was fraying. The Dothraki believed she led them into a watery oblivion. She needed a safe harbor if such a thing existed in these parts. A battered galley flying no obvious colors approached them one morning, rowed by a silent crew with some darkened faces. Daenerys's first instinct was to prepare for another ambush, but the galley signaled peacefully. Its captain, a lean man with a missing ear, shouted across the water that he came from a place called Tolos, a small city south of the bay. He invited them to dock there, promising fresh water and a chance to trade. Jorah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Tolos had a reputation as a vassal outpost for new guys, which meant slavers might be present. But Daenerys weighed her options: starve and die at sea, or risk Tolos and see what fate might bring. She ordered the captains to set sail for Tolos. From a distance, Tolos was unimpressive, a cluster of pale stone buildings perched along a strip of coastline dotted with scrubby vegetation. Its harbor was small, with a single wooden jetty that jutted into the water. A few trading vessels bobbed there, overshadowed by cliffside watchtowers. As Daenerys's ships drew nearer, the watchtowers signaled and a small crowd gathered on the shore. She looked down at Rhaego in her arms, then at the dragons perched restlessly on the gunwales. "We must tread carefully," she murmured to Jorah. He agreed with a grim nod. They disembarked slowly, letting the Dothraki lead their horses off the ships. An official in fine robes approached, a tall man with greenish-tinged tattoos on his cheeks, flanked by 2 guards in bronze helms. He introduced himself as Ormelio, a minister of trade and commerce for Tolos. His accent was thick, his Valyrian archaic, but he managed a welcoming smile when he saw Daenerys's retinue. Then he spotted the dragons. She wore Drogon on her shoulder while Viserion and Rhaego glided overhead, snapping at gulls. Ormelio's eyes widened and he took an involuntary step backward. The townsfolk murmured in alarm and awe, forming a ring around Daenerys. She took a breath and spoke in her clearest Valyrian. "I am Daenerys Storeborn of House Targaryen, Queen of the 7 Kingdoms by right, blood of the dragon. We seek fresh water and provisions, and we can pay with trade if your prices are fair." She tried to project confidence, though her resources were scant. Ormelio swallowed, nodded hastily. We have never had a queen arrive here unannounced, my lady. Tolos is small, but we do trade in hides, dyes, and salt fish. We shall be happy to discuss terms." He kept glancing at the dragons as if they might tear out his throat at any moment. Daenerys introduced Ser Jorah as her knight and a handful of her blood riders as her guard. Ormelio beckoned them to follow him into the city's modest central square, a dusty courtyard with a fountain shaped like a coiled serpent. Children peeked from behind vendors' stalls. The Dothraki eyed the low stone dwellings, unimpressed, but a few of them softened at the sight of fresh vegetables piled in baskets. It had been too long since they'd seen anything but hardtack and dried meats at sea. Negotiations began. Tolos had enough water and supplies to feed Daenerys's Khalasar for a short time, but at a cost. Ormelio eyed her with the polite greed of a man who knew a rare opportunity when he saw one. He wanted silver, gold, or perhaps exotic trade goods in return. Daenerys had some items left from Karth beaded silks, small jewels Zaro had pressed upon her, a little gold from her wedding gifts. She offered them in exchange for casks of water, fresh fruits, salted fish, and enough grain to fill the bellies of her people for a few weeks. All seemed to proceed smoothly until Ormelio ventured a suggestion. He cleared his throat, indicating the dragons. "Many in Tolos would pay princely sums for so rare a creature, your grace. Even a single egg of such a beast might make you the wealthiest queen in these parts. If you would consider a—" "No," Daenerys said, steel under her tone. "My dragons are not for barter." Ormelio hastily bowed. Of course. A slip of the tongue. But she did not miss the flicker in his eye that betrayed deeper interests. Jorah tightened his jaw. He had expected this. The presence of the dragons drew every schemer near, each of them dreaming of the power to command fire-breathing serpents. Daenerys prayed her 3 little ones would remain safe. Already Drogon spread his wings to hiss if anyone came too close, and Viserion and Rhaego had nipped at curious children who tried to pet them. She commanded her blood riders to keep watch. Meanwhile, Rhaego remained close by, wide-eyed at the bustle. She kept him swaddled and in her sight at all times. Over the following days, Daenerys's people busied themselves hauling supplies from Tolos's storehouses to the ships. A handful of local workers aided them for a small fee. The arrangement was uneventful at first. She even began to relax, grateful that Tolos was not Karth with its labyrinthine politics. But on the third evening, as twilight draped the humble settlement, a commotion broke out near the seafront. Dothraki warriors rushed back to the center of town, shouting that one of their own had been seized by local guards. Daenerys, with Jorah at her side, hurried to investigate. She found a cluster of Talosian guards surrounding a single Dothraki youth who had come to call himself Ricaro's cousin, though the Dothraki concept of family was looser than in Westeros. He was pinned to the ground, an ugly bruise forming on his cheek. The guards insisted he had tried to steal a donkey from a local stable, a crime punishable by forced labor or sale into slavery. Daenerys pressed her lips tight. She confronted the guards, scanning their ranks until Ormelio arrived, summoned by the shouting. "Your man is a thief," Ormelio declared, though his voice shook slightly under Daenerys's glare. "We have laws here. He must be punished. We are within our rights to take him in chains." Daenerys's heart pounded. She had made no illusions about Tolos. She knew it was entwined with the traditions of slavery that dominated the region. Still, to see one of her own men threatened with chains ignited a fury within her. She stepped forward, shoulders set. "He is under my protection. I will pay recompense if there was wrongdoing, but I will not allow him to be sold." The Talosian guards exchanged glances. One spat in the dirt. "Our city, our laws," he said, though he kept his tone cautious. The Dothraki standing behind Daenerys were outnumbered here in Tolos, but they had their arcs unsheathed and the settlement was hardly well defended. For a tense moment, the night air crackled with impending violence. Jorah reached for his sword. Daenerys stared down Ormelio. She realized that if this came to bloodshed, she might seize Tolos easily enough, but at a cost. Would that not brand her as an invader, a conqueror who attacked any city that displeased her? Yet letting her man be chained and sold was unthinkable. Rigo squirmed against her chest, sensing her distress. Drogon let out a low hiss from his perch on a crate, wings twitching in agitation. Into the silence, Daenerys spoke clearly. "I will pay a fair price for any damage. If a donkey was taken, I will replace it with gold or with a better mount. But I will not stand by while you enslave one of my men." Ormelio's face went through shades of indecision. "Our city's laws must be upheld," he began, "yet we do not wish trouble with a woman who commands such unusual powers." His gaze flickered to the dragons. Compensation might suffice. Daenerys did not let her relief show. "Name your price." She knew that every coin she parted with was a blow to her slender resources, but it was worth it to keep her people free. Ormelio haggled shamelessly, naming a figure far beyond the donkey's worth. Some of the onlookers smirked at his opportunism. At last, Daenerys agreed on a price half as large but still exorbitant. The Dothraki youth was released, scowling, and limped away, muttering that he had only tried to borrow the donkey. Daenerys wanted to scold him for his foolishness but reined it in. Mindful that he was hardly more than a boy, he bowed his head in shame before her. That night, she and Jorah sat on the deck of one of her ships, exhausted by the day's tension. The water lapped at the hull, and a warm breeze stirred the sails overhead. Rigo lay in a woven basket nearby, drifting in and out of infant sleep, while the dragons clustered at the edge of the deck, occasionally flaring their wings at passing seagulls. A single lantern cast shifting shadows. "Everywhere we go, we face the shadow of slavery," Daenerys said softly, gazing at Rigo's tiny fist. "I cannot pretend it does not exist, yet I do not have the strength to end it. Not yet." Jorah rested his hands on his knees. "In time, perhaps we can. Or perhaps you will find allies in the free cities or beyond. If you raised an army large enough, you could move against these slaver strongholds. You might become the breaker of chains." She gave a mirthless chuckle. "Breaker of chains. I wonder if that is my path, or if I must first claim the Iron Throne in Westeros. Will Westeros even remember me? My father died before I was born. My brother was killed by the usurper's men. Another brother was killed by the Lannisters, or so the tales say. Westeros is torn by war, if the rumors from traveling merchants are correct. A boy king sits the Iron Throne, or else it is the Queen Regent who holds the real power. The North rebels under some young wolf lord. The Baratheon brothers fight each other." She exhaled. "They have no reason to yearn for a Targaryen, yet the throne is mine by blood." Jorah studied her with deep concern. "They may not yearn for you, but they will learn to respect you, and in time perhaps they'll kneel. But we cannot rush headlong into that fight. Not yet." His voice dipped, recalling all the dangers they had already survived. Daenerys said nothing for a long while, just gazed at the starlight reflecting on the Black Sea. At length, she reached over and brushed Jorah's bandaged forearm. He had taken a deeper cut in the Basilisk Isle's ambush than he'd admitted. "You have bled for me more times than I can count. You killed my son and stars to save me from a fate we can only guess at. If ever we take the throne in Westeros, or if ever we liberate the slave cities, know that you have a place beside me." He bowed his head, wrestling with a swirl of emotions: love, guilt, gratitude, longing. In some distant corner of his heart, he wondered if she would ever truly forgive him for Drogo's death, or if her words of acknowledgement might be all the absolution he would receive. But for now, it was enough. At dawn, they made ready to depart Tolos. Ormelio stood by on the shore, giving a stiff farewell, perhaps relieved to see the dragons and their fierce companions departing. Daenerys' ships, now stocked with water and supplies, drifted away from the harbor, and the people of Tolos breathed easier once the silhouettes of the vessels vanished over the horizon. Yet Daenerys left Tolos with a troubled heart. She knew that if the entire region embraced slavery as a matter of law, every city she visited might pose the same moral quandary. She would not yield her own people to chains, and she refused to trade her dragons for safe passage. The question weighed on her: would she need to become the aggressor, toppling these cities one by one, if that was the only way to carve a future free of bondage? But what if that turned her into a conqueror little better than those who used whips to rule? The next leg of the journey took them farther around the curve of Slavers Bay. The land to the north was parched, with rocky hills and patches of scrub. The water shimmered under the relentless sun. Daenerys' Dothraki began to whisper about returning to the grasslands. They were horse lords, not seafarers. She soothed them with promises that soon they might ride across new plains, for Essos was vast. She had no intention of taking them deeper into the Great Waste or the Red Sands that had tested them so severely before. Instead, she considered heading for Lazer, the land of the Lamb Men. She had seen it once with Drogo. But that memory stirred sorrow, and she was unsure if the route was wise. Days blurred into nights. The dragons grew bolder in their flights around the rigging, snatching fish from the water's surface. Rhaego, though still an infant, began to babble with more insistence, reaching for Daenerys' hair and Jorah's beard. Some of the Dothraki took it as a sign of strength that the boy did not cry as often at the crash of waves. Irri would cradle him and sing Dothraki lullabies, calling him the son of the great Khal. One morning, the lookout spotted an unfamiliar banner over the waves, a long, lean galley flying a bright purple sail. At once, speculation arose. Some said it might be a trading ship from Volantis, others feared it was a pirate vessel. Daenerys ordered her small fleet to stay close, forming a rough defensive line. To her relief, the purple-sailed galley did not seem to maneuver for an attack. Instead, it hoisted a flag of parley. Daenerys met the galley's captain on her ship's deck, with Jorah and her blood riders at her side. The captain introduced himself as Beles of the Purple Harbor, a free trader affiliated with no city in particular. He had heard rumors of a silver-haired woman with dragons traveling these seas, a woman who might be seeking alliances or safe passage. Daenerys listened warily, but he seemed forthright enough. His gaze lingered on the dragons, yes, and on the Dothraki scowls, but he made no attempt to conceal his amazement. Beles offered tidings from the rest of the world. He spoke of turmoil in Westeros. King Robert Baratheon was dead, replaced by his son, though the boy's legitimacy was widely doubted. The north was in open rebellion. Riverrun and the Riverlands were aflame with war. Stannis Baratheon claimed kingship, as did Renly, but one of them was rumored to have died under strange circumstances. Beles was not certain of the details. Meanwhile, in Essos, the free cities jockeyed for advantage, especially now that rumors of living dragons had begun to spread among the ports. Daenerys' heart pounded at the mention of Westeros. It seemed the realm was indeed embroiled in the War of the Five Kings, or perhaps 6 if Balon Greyjoy had joined the fray. The details were scattered, but they told a tale of chaos. "What do they say of House Targaryen?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do the lords of Westeros tremble at the thought of a dragon returned from exile?" Beles shrugged. "They say little, my lady. Your name is known only in bits of rumor, overshadowed by the more immediate conflict of claimants. Some speak of a daughter of the Mad King still alive, but many doubt it. Word distracts them." He eyed her, as if wondering if she would be disappointed or relieved. "But who can say what might happen when the truth of your dragons becomes undeniable?" Daenerys felt an unexpected flash of anger that her claim was dismissed so easily. She would not remain a rumor forever. "One day they will know my name," she said quietly, "and the Iron Throne will be mine." Beles inclined his head, betraying no judgment. There are many who would support such a cause, especially if you offered them gold or positions, or simply if you had enough steel at your back. The Golden Company sells its swords in the east, the Second Sons, the Storm Bros. Sells word companies in Essos might throw in with you if the price is right. Jorah nodded slightly. He had mentioned this possibility to Daenerys before, buying a Sellsword army. But that required coin she did not have. Beles, reading their faces, offered a quiet smile and said, "If you are bound for the free cities, you might find patrons or cunning deals to fill your coffers. If you are bound for Westeros eventually, you may also want to consider your approach to Slaver's Bay. Word is, the city of Astapor sells warriors known as the Unsullied, elite eunuch soldiers feared across the world. Though they come at a heavy price." Daenerys knew the name Unsullied from scraps of conversation. They were disciplined soldiers, famed for their absolute obedience. But they were slaves. She felt her skin prickle at the idea of purchasing an army of slaves. Would that not make her complicit in the same cruelty she loathed? Yet, if she wanted to break the chains of the slaver cities, if she wanted to take the Iron Throne from the usurpers, did she have a choice but to wage war? And for war, she needed soldiers who would obey her, not desert at the first sign of adversity. She thanked Beles for his information, and he departed, sailing eastward while Daenerys' ships continued west. A subdued hush fell over her entourage in the aftermath of his revelations. War raged in Westeros, yet they were a world away, searching for the means to cross an ocean. The question of the Unsullied lingered in her mind like a thorn. She broached it with Jorah one evening, when the sun bled into the horizon. "They are slave soldiers," she said, pacing on the deck while her dragons watched with bright, curious eyes. "How can I call myself the breaker of chains if I buy men who have been brutalized into obedience?" Jorah's expression was grave. "I cannot answer that for you, my queen, yet I have seen the Unsullied fight years ago when I was still a knight of Westeros. They are beyond compare in discipline. 1,000 Unsullied can stand against many times their number of common troops. If your goal is to free the millions of slaves in these cities, to shatter their cruel economy, perhaps you need the might to do it. Freeing one city with a small force is feasible if that city is small and disorganized. But Yunkai, Astapor, Meereen, these are powerful. And Westeros even more so." She exhaled, her mind churning. "If I were to buy them, perhaps I could free them afterward, command them as their liberator rather than their owner." Yet the moral quandary remained. Would she be feeding the system she wished to destroy? Drogon made a small rumble in his throat, as if echoing her agitation. She reached out and let his snout brush her palm. He was the largest of the three, already the size of a small dog. She could feel the promise of heat in his belly. Someday, perhaps, he would rain fire upon her enemies. But not now. Now he was still a vulnerable creature. They all were, in a sense. Days passed as they skirted the edges of the Gulf of Grief, navigating carefully to avoid pirates from the Isle of Cedars or the rumored war galleys of New Guise. At last, the coast shifted, revealing a wide sweep of bay dotted with ships. Low dunes and scattered vegetation lined the shoreline. Farther inland, the spires and walls of a city rose in pale pink stone. Astapor. Even from a distance, Daenerys could see the great harbors and the array of vessels, slavers, traders, and perhaps mercenaries. The sails bore every color and sigil under the sun. Astapor's architecture glowed in the day's light, an eerie rose hue that belied the brutality within. No Dothraki horde had ever tried to sack Astapor. As far as Daenerys knew, the city was well fortified, and the Dothraki disliked fighting disciplined armies behind walls. Yet here she was, approaching it with a handful of worn ships, a small khalasar, and 3 baby dragons. Madness, perhaps, but also possibility. She might find a chance to replenish supplies. She might even speak to the good masters who bred the Unsullied, see for herself the cost of these soldiers. She had not decided if she would buy them or if she would find some other path. But something in her demanded she see the truth up close. If she was to break the system, she first needed to understand it fully. Jorah and the Dothraki gazed on Astapor with tense curiosity. They dropped anchor in the crowded harbor, thick with the stench of rotting fish and sweaty bodies. Dockworkers and slavers roamed the piers. The moment Daenerys's ships came into view, tongues began to wag. Whispers spread of a silver-haired woman with small dragons perched on her rails. By the time Daenerys disembarked, Rhaego strapped against her front, Drogon coiled protectively around her shoulders, a throng of onlookers had gathered. Some eyed her with greedy speculation, others with open awe. A few, seeing the dragons, touched their brows as though warding off evil spirits. The good masters of Astapor wasted little time sending an emissary. A plump, perfumed man in a sheer robe of pinkish cloth approached, flanked by 2 bodyguards in polished bronze armor. He introduced himself in formal Valyrian. His name was Grazdin Mo Ulher. He bowed in exaggerated courtesy, though his eyes flicked with cunning as he took in the sight of Daenerys' small retinue. "My queen," he purred, "we in Astapor have heard rumors of your exceptional pets. We are most eager to extend our hospitality. The good masters welcome all who have gold to spend, especially on our renowned Unsullied." He gazed pointedly at Drogon, who hissed. Grazdin blinked rapidly and stepped back a pace, then forced a nervous laugh. "Your dragons are wondrous indeed." Daenerys kept her expression cool. "I will speak with your good masters about the Unsullied," she replied. "But know this, I do not suffer insult lightly. Nor do my pets." Her tone was as measured as she could manage, though inside her stomach churned with disgust at the man's oily manners. She could almost feel Rhaego shift against her chest, as if even he sensed her tension. Grazdin bowed again, gesturing toward the city's gates. "Then come. There is much to show you if you have the stomach for it." The way he said it made Daenerys' pulse quicken with unease. She glanced at Jorah. He gave the smallest nod, stepping closer to her side as they followed Grazdin along a wide boulevard lined with palatial structures. Pink sandstone walls were carved with ghastly reliefs, scenes of cruelty, slaves in chains, soldiers in neat lines. The heat was oppressive, and the smell of decay and sweat made her throat tighten. The Dothraki behind her muttered at the sight of so many chained figures, house slaves fanning their masters, children pulling carts, half-naked men cleaning the streets. Graffiti on a wall depicted a dragon devouring a city. She wondered if it was an omen or an idle piece of blasphemy. They arrived at a courtyard overshadowed by a massive statue, an Astapori warrior in stylized armor. Beyond the statue lay training yards where ranks of Unsullied drilled under the lash of overseers. Daenerys drew a sharp breath at the sight, hundreds of eunuch soldiers, each armed with a short spear and round shield, all moving in perfect unison. Not one face showed emotion or fatigue. They were silent, obedient, terrifying in their precision. Grazdin smiled like a merchant unveiling his finest wares. "These are but a fraction of our Unsullied. Each one is tested beyond mortal limits. They do not feel pain as other men do. They do not fear. They do not break. They are the finest infantry in the world." He paused, letting the words sink in. "With these at your command, great queen, no city could stand against you. Even Westeros would fall before your might." Daenerys' eyes flicked to Jorah, then back to the soldiers. She recalled how the Dothraki relied on speed and ferocity, how knights of Westeros trusted in heavy armor and cavalry charges. But these Unsullied were a different breed, remorseless, unstoppable foot soldiers who did not question orders. Slaves trained from childhood to obey. She felt ill, yet also enthralled by their potential. What might she accomplish with an army that would never desert, never mutiny? Drogon let out a small keening sound, as if disturbed by the aura of the yard. Daenerys lightly petted his scaled neck. She forced herself to watch as an overseer demonstrated the Unsullied's tolerance for pain by driving a dagger into a soldier's arm. The soldier did not flinch, did not even blink. Blood dribbled, but his face was a mask of emptiness. Jorah cursed under his breath. The Dothraki behind them snarled. Grazdin turned with a smug grin. "They feel nothing," he repeated. Daenerys clenched her teeth. "They feel something," she said quietly, "but they have been taught not to show it." Grazdin waved a hand dismissively. "Does the Iraq weep when it cuts flesh? They are weapons, dear queen, pure and simple. Now, shall we discuss terms?" She hesitated, torn between revulsion and the knowledge that an army was precisely what she needed. Her mind flashed with images of the slave markets in Astapor, the whimpering of children, the brand marks on men's chests. If she purchased the Unsullied, was she feeding that same evil, or would she be forging a path to end it? Before she could answer, a commotion sounded from the yard's entrance. A group of Astapori guards hustled in, dragging 2 ragged figures by chains. The captives were a man and a woman, both bruised and gaunt. Grazdin paused to see the disturbance. One of the guards barked that these two had tried to flee their master. The law demanded they be punished. The man spat at the guard's feet, cursing in a language Daenerys did not recognize. The woman, half sobbing, clung to him. Daenerys felt her throat tighten. She remembered the donkey boy in Tolos. Here, the punishments would likely be far worse. Grasden flicked his eyes to Daenerys, as if waiting to gauge her reaction. "Runaways," he said with a shrug. "Will have their hands removed or perhaps something worse to teach them. They belong to one of our good masters, you see." Daenerys's Dothraki stirred behind her, grip tightening on her rocks. They still hated the notion of slavery, even though the Dothraki had once practiced it in their own raids. Daenerys felt the weight of her newborn dragons on her conscience. The very notion of letting this cruelty stand. She wanted to do something, but she had only a handful of men in a city of thousands of slavers. She had Rhaego to protect, and she had no illusions about the good master's readiness to unleash their own soldiers if she stirred trouble. Her silence weighed heavily. Grasden smirked, interpreting it as acceptance. He gestured, and a guard yanked the chain, dragging the screaming woman away. Daenerys closed her eyes for an instant, a swirl of rage and helplessness in her chest. If she had an army, the thought hammered at her. If she had the Unsullied, she could put an end to such scenes. She could seize Astapor, free these wretches. But the cost of that was entering into a deal with devils. Was that how a Targaryen queen should rule? By making deals with slavers to destroy slavers? The rest of the day blurred. Grasden led her through palatial halls, offering sweet wines and spiced meats. He extolled the virtues of each Unsullied battalion. He named a price that made Daenerys' head spin. Thousands of slaves would require thousands of gold marks, or their equivalent in trade goods or valuables. She did not have such resources, but the good masters had heard whispers that she possessed living dragons. And dragons were priceless. She swallowed thickly. The idea of trading even one dragon was repugnant. Yet might she sacrifice one to save millions of slaves? And to acquire the means to take Westeros? Was that not, perhaps, a fair trade? She felt Drogon's claws upon her shoulder, a sharp reminder that these creatures were her children, as dear to her as Rhaego. No mother would trade one child to save another. Still, the city's cruelty gnawed at her, forcing her to imagine desperate measures. That night, she and Jorah withdrew to the cramped lodging provided for them, an antechamber in one of the lesser mansions near the harbor. Her Dothraki camped outside, uneasy in the slaver city. Daenerys paced, Rhaego fussing in Irie's arms. The child felt her agitation. Jorah watched her with a troubled expression. "You do not truly consider giving them a dragon?" She sank onto a low couch, pressing her fingertips to her temples. I don't know. If I gave them one dragon, they would give me thousands of Unsullied. Enough to take the city, to free all slaves here, to begin forging a power base. Then, perhaps, I could turn that army against Yunkai and Meereen, freeing more slaves, building more strength, and eventually cross the sea to Westeros. The good masters would be undone. My dragons would still number 2, and the city would be in my hands. He crouched before her. "My queen, do you trust these men to keep their bargain once they hold one of your dragons? They could use it against you, or they might kill it out of ignorance. Dragons cannot be mastered easily, especially by those who do not share your blood. And what would it do to your spirit, sacrificing a dragon for an army of eunuchs, even if you do intend to free them? You are the mother of dragons as well as the mother of your son. These beasts were born from your fire." Tears stung her eyes. She hated that she even considered the idea, but she also hated the sight of men and women in chains, the knowledge that Westeros was mired in war while she remained powerless. Every path seemed to involve moral compromise, or else endless waiting for her dragons to grow. And waiting meant thousands remained in bondage, or died in the crossfire of petty kings in Westeros. She drew a shaky breath. "I cannot stay here long without deciding. The good masters will not abide me in their city forever with my dragons, not if I don't intend to buy. And if I linger, I risk another attempt to steal or kill my children." She met his gaze. If we leave, we return to the sea with nothing gained. My people's morale will collapse. We cannot cross the narrow sea with so few men. We can barely sail from port to port as it is. Our coin grows thinner by the day. Jorah exhaled. Then we must be cunning. If there is a way to gain the Unsullied without truly sacrificing a dragon, or if there is a way to free them by guile or force, but that is a tall order with so few swords at our side. We would need to outwit the entire city. He paused. I have seen you do the impossible before, Daenerys. You walked into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerged unburnt. Perhaps the gods have more miracles in store for you. His words offered a slender thread of hope. She smiled bitterly. Miracles or illusions, one may suffice if we plan well. Gazing at Rhaego, who reached out a tiny hand, she kissed his forehead. The child cooed, ignorant of the burdens on his mother. Drogon curled at her feet, let out a puff of smoke. She felt his warmth, a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. The following morning, Daenerys summoned Grasdan Mo Ulher to the mansion's courtyard. She stood with Rhaego in her arms, Jorah at her left, and two of her blood riders at her right. The dragons circled overhead, casting flickering shadows. Grasdan arrived with a retinue of scribes and guards, expecting some new negotiation. She greeted him with solemn courtesy. Then, in measured Valyrian, she said, I will buy all your Unsullied. Everyone in training, everyone who wears the collar of your city. Every last one. Grasdan blinked, then laughed as if certain he had misheard. All? That would be 8,000 fully trained Unsullied, plus those still in training. A staggering number. Even the richest of princes seldom buy half that. He eyed her meager retinue with something like pity. Daenerys let no hint of doubt creep into her face. I said all. Name your price. The scribe conferred with Grasdan. He rubbed his hands together. The price would be extraordinary. Perhaps more than you have. Unless, his eyes flicked upward to where Drogon soared, trailing wisps of smoke. You would part with your largest, most fearsome dragon. Yes, that might suffice. One dragon plus enough gold to cover the rest, if you have it. The good masters do not relish gold alone, but that creature would tip the scales. Does the deal intrigue you? A hush fell. Daenerys felt Jorah tense beside her. Her stomach twisted, but she kept her expression cold, regal. One dragon, she said, and we will discuss the gold. She named the sum of gold and jewels she had left, an amount far short of the actual cost. Grasdan Z. Yes, glittered with triumph, clearly believing he had outsmarted her. He demanded the largest dragon, that black fiend with red wings. Daenerys hesitated, swallowing a lump in her throat, then gave a single nod. Done, she whispered. Grasdan's scribe penned the contract. Jorah nearly spoke up, but he caught the steel in Daenerys's gaze and remained silent, trusting she had some plan not yet shared. The good masters wanted immediate exchange, but Daenerys convinced them to set the formal transfer for the next day, at noon, in the plaza before Astapor's Great Pyramid. The Unsullied would be assembled, and she would present Drogon. That night, she lay awake, Rhaego sleeping fitfully at her side. The two smaller dragons curled near his makeshift crib, while Drogon perched on a rafter overhead. She stared at the pinkish stone of the ceiling, trying to quell her racing thoughts. She remembered the first time Drogon fed from her hand, the faint warmth of his breath on her palm. She remembered how he burned her enemies in the desert, how he soared above the caravans. Giving him away felt like a betrayal of all she had fought for. Yet she recalled also how she had tried to save the donkey boy in Tolos, the runaways in Astapor, and the thousands more languishing in chains. If this gambit worked, she might free them all. If it failed, she would lose more than a dragon. She would lose the faith of her followers, perhaps her life. Dawn broke too swiftly. She rose, dressed in a flowing gown of pale blue that still carried a faint scent of salt from the ship. Irri braided her hair in the Dothraki style, weaving in a small silver bell to mark the battles Daenerys had survived. Rhaego was left in the care of Jiki with a handful of loyal Dothraki as guards. Daenerys gave him a gentle kiss, praying she would return. They proceeded to the Great Plaza, an expanse of red sandstone pavers, ringed by towering statues of ancient Giscari kings. Thousands of Unsullied stood at attention, row upon row of eunuch soldiers, weapons gleaming. The good masters assembled as well, bedecked in pink and maroon silks, some wearing tall headdresses shaped like the harpy, a twisted figure of myth. Grasdan Mo Ulher strutted at the forefront, a wide grin on his face. By his side stood a line of lesser overseers, some holding whips. Their eyes roved hungrily to the black dragon that flew overhead, spitting small gouts of flame. Daenerys walked into that sea of pink stone, Jorah close behind, tension radiating from him. She carried a slender rod of leather in her hand, a makeshift whip with a gold pommel, a symbol of command. Grasdan had demanded it as part of the ritual. "When I hand you this whip," he had said, "you shall own the Unsullied, and in return, I shall have your black dragon." Those were the terms, spelled out with mocking ceremonial flourish. Daenerys extended the whip. Grasdan took it, then faced her, raising his voice so all could hear. "On this day, the good masters of Astapor give the Unsullied 8,000 strong, plus those still in training unto Daenerys Storeborn in exchange for the creature Drogon and certain amounts of gold." He turned to her. "You hold the whip and thus you hold their lives. Do you understand?" She stared at the rows of Unsullied, each face blank as stone, each soul battered by years of torment. Her own voice trembled only slightly as she asked, "Do they belong to me now?" "They belong to you," Grasdan affirmed smugly, "from the first beat of their hearts to the last beat of their drums. Show them who their master is." "Strike the whip." Daenerys' gaze lifted to the sky where Drogon circled. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to speak a single word in High Valyrian and order, "Dracarys." With that word, chaos erupted. Drogon roared, an ear-splitting sound that echoed off the statues. A jet of fire poured from his jaws, searing across the dais. Grasdan Mo Ulher shrieked, stumbling backward as flames licked at the pink cloth of his robes. Daenerys flung the whip aside, whirled to the Unsullied. "Slay the masters," she commanded in her clearest Valyrian. "Slay anyone who holds a whip, anyone who stands in your path. From this moment, you are free. If you choose to fight for me, fight. If you choose to lay down your arms, you may do so. But no more will you be slaves." A stunned silence swallowed the plaza, broken an instant later by the snap and ring of spears. The Unsullied turned on their overseers, some so swiftly that the whips never had time to crack. Grasdan tried to scream for help, but Drogon descended upon him, flame rushing forth, melting gold and flesh alike. The good masters scattered, flailing. Jorah roared for the Dothraki to join the fray. The pink city erupted in fury. Daenerys stood at the center of it, eyes stinging with smoke, her heart pounding with savage exhilaration. Slaves flung down their chains. Freedmen and women ran from doorways to see their oppressors fall. In the swirl of violence, not every Unsullied obeyed her order to avoid slaughtering the innocent, but for the most part, they aimed their spears at the overseers. The watchers in the stands shrieked and fled. Some city guards tried to rally, but the Unsullied were unstoppable, a tide of perfect discipline. The battle for Astapor raged through midday. Daenerys strode through the choking smoke with her new soldiers parting to let her pass. She found pockets of resistance, good masters barricaded in mansions, city guards forming shield walls. But the Unsullied advanced methodically, crushing each holdout. By evening, the city lay in Daenerys' hands, and the great harpy statue that crowned the main gate was pulled down in a thunderous crash. The freed slaves exulted, chanting her name. She had done it, liberated an entire city without paying the price the good masters demanded. Drogon flew overhead, singed but alive, while Viserion and Regal soared behind him, breathing smaller jets of flame. Daenerys found Jorah in the aftermath, blood spattered on his armor, a slash across his brow. She smiled through tears. "We will free them all," she whispered. "City by city, if we must. No more chains." He pressed a hand to her shoulder, speechless, gazing at the newly freed throngs. The Dothraki, elated, galloped through the streets, proclaiming the Mother of Dragons had done the impossible. And the Unsullied, 8,000 strong, stood silent but watchful. They had been told they could leave if they wished, unbound by any collar or brand. Yet not one turned away. They had been stripped of everything but war, and in Daenerys they saw a commander who promised a nobler purpose. Many knelt before her, awaiting her command. As night fell, Daenerys rose to address them from the steps of the Great Pyramid. Flames flickered in torches, casting shifting shadows over the pink stone. Gathered in the plaza were thousands of newly freed people, men, women, children. She held Rego in her arms, the boy gazing wonderingly at the torches, half asleep. Drogon perched behind her on the ledge, red eyes gleaming in the darkness. Jorah stood at her right, the Blood Riders at her left. The Unsullied formed neat ranks across the plaza. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "You owe me nothing," Daenerys said in a voice that carried over the hush. "I did not buy you. I freed you. If you would join me, we will march on Yukai, then on Mirin, and break every chain we find. If you wish to leave, go with my blessing. I will not hold you here." She paused, scanning their faces. Most were expressionless, but she sensed the stirrings of something deeper, hope, perhaps. "We will not be slavers. We will not be tyrants. We will be free people, bound by loyalty given, not forced. Will you ride with me?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the chanting began. It rippled through the ranks, a word in Giscari Valyrian, Misa. Misa, mother. It spread among the newly freed as well. They raised their hands, voices growing until it resounded through the entire plaza, echoing off the city walls. Misa, Misa. Daenerys felt tears slip down her cheeks. She hugged Rhaego closer, letting him see the sea of uplifted faces. Her dragons hissed softly as though they understood the raw emotion in the air. She turned to Jorah, who gazed at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You killed Drogo to save me from a fate we cannot know," she murmured. "But this is what I must do now to make meaning of all we have lost." He inclined his head, a rare smile curving his lips. "You have become more than a Khaleesi, my queen. You may just reshape this entire world." She stood there, letting the cries of Misa fill her ears, letting the bond with the Unsullied and the freed slaves settle in her heart. Tomorrow, she would see the devastation left by the day's battle, the wounded, the dead. Tomorrow, she would plan the march to Yukai. Tomorrow, she would face 1,000 new challenges. But tonight, for one brief moment, she allowed herself to savor the victory. She had not let her dragon be sold. She had undone the slavers' hold on Astapor in a single scorching day. And though the road ahead was long, for the first time she felt certain that her destiny was not simply to reclaim the Iron Throne, but to break the chains of all those in bondage if she could. If her dragons grew in strength, if her alliances held, if the child in her arms could thrive in a world not ruled by whips and fear. She closed her eyes, letting Rhaego's soft breath brush her cheek. Above, Drogon stretched his wings, the firelight painting his scales in red gold. The chanting continued, Misa, Misa, rising like a tide of faith. Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons, had begun her war against the old order. Far across the sea, the lords of Westeros fought their own battles, oblivious to the storm building in Essos. Soon enough, they would learn. For tonight, Astapor belonged to Daenerys. And in her arms, the child of Khal Drogo, the child Jorah had once saved with a blade, dozed on, unknowing, a small hand resting on the mother who had just changed the fate of thousands. The moon rose high above the city, ghostly pale against the darkness, and Daenerys gazed up at it, remembering the old words she had once said to Drogo, "You are my sun and stars, and I am your moon." Now she was a moon that carried its own light, a reflection of no man's brilliance but of her own. Tomorrow would test that light again, but she would face it unbowed. She was Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name, blood of the dragon, unburnt mother of a new age, and her path stretched onward like a blaze through the night.